I watched my daughter get evicted. I watched her work a brutal cafe job until she collapsed from exhaustion every night. I did nothing to help her, even though I had millions. Because my dead husband's last wish was to save her from herself. My name is Margaret, but everyone who ever meant something to me has always called me Maggie. I'm 72 years old, and for the last 8 months, since my husband Frank passed, I've been living a life measured in quiet firsts. The first birthday without him. The first storm that rattled the windows without his hand on my shoulder. The first time I had to call a plumber. Today was another first. I was sitting in my favorite little cafe in Mornington, the one with the sun that hits the tables just right in the late morning, when my phone buzzed. It was my daughter, Chloe. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't the one I remembered from her childhood. It was the crisp, efficient voice of a stranger. "Mum," she started. No warmth, no preamble. "Liam and I are heading off. The final investment for the tech startup came through, and we're flying out to Singapore tomorrow to seal the deal. Just a heads up, we had to liquefy some assets to meet the capital requirements. The holiday house in Lorne has been sold. Frank's old Ford Falcon, too. It's all been handled. I'll talk to you when we're back." And just like that, with the sterile precision of a surgeon, she severed the last remaining threads of my old life and hung up. The chatter of the cafe, the clinking of cups, the barista calling out an order, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. My hand was still holding the phone, my thumb hovering over her name. I looked down at my coffee, a latte that had been perfectly warm just moments before, now a cold, forgotten thing in a ceramic mug. 46 years of raising her, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of cheering at her graduation and holding her hand on her wedding day. All of it, our entire shared history, reduced to the term liquefied assets. She hadn't sold a house. She had sold the walls that held the echoes of her own laughter. She hadn't sold a car. She had sold the very vessel of our family's journey. For a moment, I felt nothing. Not anger, not even a tremor of sadness, just a profound, hollow emptiness. It's a strange thing, grief. The first wave when Frank died nearly drowned me. This second wave, delivered through a 30-second phone call, was different. It was a silent, creeping frost, numbing everything it touched. It's funny how a single phone call can reveal the kilometers of distance that have grown between you and someone you love. Have you ever felt a moment like that? A single sentence that changes everything? Let me know in the comments below. I'd really like to know I'm not alone in this. That old Ford Falcon wasn't just metal and paint. It was Frank. He was a builder, a man whose love was shown not in flowery words but in the solid, dependable things he built and cared for. Every Sunday morning, he'd be out in the driveway of our home here on the peninsula, bucket and sponge in hand, washing that car with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. He'd taught Chloe to drive in that car, his hand hovering nervously over the handbrake as she kangaroo hopped down our quiet street. Its back seat had carried sandy towels and wet dogs and sleeping children back from countless trips down the great ocean road. The scent of him, a faint mix of sawdust, motor oil, and Old Spice, was still woven into the fabric of the seats. Or it was, until today. And the house in Lorne. Frank built half of it himself. He'd spent 2 full summers finishing the deck, the one that looked out over the ocean, the one where we drank our tea every morning. It was where we marked Chloe's height on the kitchen door frame, a ladder of pencil marks charting her journey from a little girl into a young woman. It was where she brought her first boyfriend, and later, Liam, a man with a smile as bright as his ambition and eyes that never seemed to stop calculating. I never fully trusted him. He spoke of disruption and innovation, of scaling businesses and leveraging assets. To him, our simple, happy life was something that needed to be leveraged. And now it seemed it had been. He and Chloe had looked at our life's work, our sanctuary of memories, and had seen only a number on a page, a stepping stone to their next big venture in Singapore. They saw capital. I saw the ghost of my husband's hand on a banister he had sanded smooth. But as I sat there, a strange calm began to settle in my bones. I took a slow sip of my cold coffee and smiled, a tiny, secret smile just for myself. Because there was something my daughter, in all her cleverness, didn't know. My quiet, careful Frank, the man who planned everything, had planned for this day too. I left a $10 note on the table, more than enough for the coffee, and walked out of the cafe into the blindingly bright Mornington Sunday. The world seemed to be moving in slow motion. A tram rattled by in the distance, a sound so familiar it was part of my heartbeat, yet today it sounded alien. The drive home was short, just a few kilometers through the tree-lined streets I've known my entire adult life, but I don't remember any of it. My hands were on the wheel, my foot was on the pedals, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was walking through a quiet, sunlit memory, guided by the ghost of my husband's hand. There was no panic, no frantic rush of tears. That would come later, I suppose. Right now, there was only a singular crystalline purpose. Frank had been a builder. He believed in foundations. And I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he had left one last foundation in place for me. I pulled into our driveway, the crunch of the gravel under the tires a familiar sound of arrival. Our home is a simple, honest brick house, the kind they built in the 70s to last forever. Frank's roses, which I'd faithfully tended since he passed, were in full bloom, a riot of defiant red against the cream-colored brick. I walked past the front door, my keys still in my hand, and went straight around the side of the house, my feet following a path worn into the grass over 40 years. My destination was the shed, Frank's shed. It was his sanctuary, his kingdom. The door creaked open with the sound of a long, weary sigh, and I was hit with the scent of him. A potent cocktail of sawdust, soil, and decades of hard work. The air was thick with the smell of old paint, grease, and the faint metallic tang of rust. Spiders had woven empires in the corners, and dust motes danced like fairies in the single beam of light slanting through the grimy window. This was Frank's world. His old fishing rods, brittle with age, leaned against one wall. Shelves overflowed with jam jars filled with every screw, nail, and bolt imaginable, each meticulously labeled in his handwriting. It was an organized chaos that only he understood. A stranger would see junk. I saw a library of a well-lived life. My eyes scanned the room, bypassing the lawnmower, the workbench with its heavy vise, the stacks of timber offcuts he swore he'd use for something one day. I knew what I was looking for. Against the back wall, under a faded canvas tarp, was his first-ever toolbox. A heavy, industrial gray steel box he'd bought as a 16-year-old apprentice. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, a testament to the fact that he hadn't used it in years, preferring the newer, lighter tools for his daily work. But he never got rid of it. "You never forget where you started, Maggie," he'd told me once. The latches were stiff, and they groaned in protest as I clicked them open. The heavy lid creaked back, revealing the top tray. It was exactly as I'd always known it. His old wood-handled hammer, its head mushroomed from a million strikes. A collection of stubby pencils, their ends chewed. A thermos, dented and scratched, that had held his tea on thousands of cold Melbourne mornings. Everything was in its place, a perfect tableau of a working man's life. I felt a pang in my chest, a sharp jab of grief so intense it almost took my breath away. Frank was a man who believed actions spoke louder than words. His secret wasn't a wall to keep me out, it was a fortress built to keep me safe. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What quiet plans the people who love us most might be making on our behalf, completely without our knowledge. My fingers, trembling ever so slightly now, closed around the handles of the top tray. I lifted it out and set it carefully on the dusty concrete floor. And there, beneath it, my heart gave a single powerful thud. It wasn't more tools. It was a large, handsome leather document folder, nestled in the clean rags Frank used for his finest finishing work. It was immaculate, the dark brown leather showing no signs of age or neglect. It was so utterly out of place in this dusty, greasy box, and yet it was so perfectly Frank. Practicality on the outside, precious things hidden within. Lying on top of the folder was a simple white envelope. My name, Maggie, was written across the front in his strong, familiar script. I picked it up. The paper was cool against my skin. The world outside the shed fell away. There was only the silence, the dust motes, and the feeling of my husband's presence, as solid and real as the timber beams above my head. I took the folder and the letter, closed the lid of the toolbox, and walked out of the shed, back into the light. It was time to see the plans the builder had left behind. I sat at the kitchen table, the heart of our home, with the afternoon sun streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes still dancing in the air. The house was so quiet you could hear the old refrigerator humming. In front of me lay the leather folder and the simple white envelope addressed to Maggie. For a moment, I just looked at Frank's handwriting, tracing the letters of my name with my finger. It was as if he were in the room with me. I decided to read his letter first. The folder could wait. The letter was for my heart. The folder was for my head. My hands were surprisingly steady as I slid my nail under the flap and broke the seal. The single folded page inside smelled faintly of his workshop, a scent of wood and honesty. "My Maggie," it began, and I had to pause to catch my breath. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I'm sorry for that, more than you'll ever know. I'm also sorry for what I'm about to show you. Not because it's bad, but because I kept it from you. I always felt that my job was to build us a good life, and your job was to make that life beautiful. I never wanted to worry your head with numbers, with stock markets, and property yields. Our life was about us, about Chloe, about the garden. That was our real wealth. This other stuff," he had underlined the word, "this was just my project. My way of making sure the foundations were deep enough that nothing could ever shake you." The last line of the letter simply said, "Look inside the folder now. Don't be angry. Just know I did it all for you. Always, Frank." With a deep breath, I untied the small leather strap on the folder and opened it. There were no loose papers, no confusing mess. Frank was too organized for that. The very first page was a clear, neatly typed document in a plastic sleeve. The title at the top read, F&M Holdings Ty, Limited, Asset Portfolio Statement, F&M Frank and Maggie. A company I never knew existed, a name that bound us together in a way I was only just discovering. My eyes scanned down the page, and the world began to tilt on its axis. It wasn't a list. It was an empire built in secret by a man who wore work boots held together with duct tape. First was commercial real estate. It listed a small, fully tenanted block of 4 shops in the booming regional center of Geelong, a place Frank had always said was solid as a rock. It also listed a medium-sized warehouse in an industrial park in Laverton, strategically close to the port. The total value next to that section read, $2,200,000. I felt my jaw go slack. My mind reeled. Next was land holdings. I saw the entry for a large, 10-hectare parcel of undeveloped land just outside Ballarat, another area he'd been quietly optimistic about for years. Value, $800,000. My mind flashed back to all the times he'd said we couldn't afford a fancy overseas trip, and I'd felt a pang of disappointment. I had no idea he was buying entire fields instead. The last section was a share portfolio. It was a long list of names I recognized from the news: CSL, Wesfarmers, Macquarie Group, BHP, the solid, dependable giants of the Australian economy. He hadn't been gambling. He had been planting trees, knowing they would grow slowly and steadily over decades. The value of the portfolio was listed at over $1,500,000. At the very bottom of the page, in bold, was the final number, the sum of a lifetime of silent work. Total estimated net worth, $4,512,000. I put the paper down and looked around my simple kitchen. The linoleum floor was worn near the sink. The kettle was a 10-year-old model from Kmart. We lived a life of careful, comfortable modesty. Frank had packed his own lunch every single day of his working life, not because we had to, but because it was the sensible thing to do. The money, I realized with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity, was never the point. It was an abstraction to him, a project. It was the builder, building one last, indestructible house for me to live in. He was the quietest man in any room, but his legacy turned out to be the loudest. It's strange how we often measure a person's success by what we can see, the car, the house, the title. But maybe the greatest legacies are the ones built in silence, the ones we never even know about. Do you have someone like that in your life? A quiet pillar of strength? I carefully placed the statement back in the folder, my movements slow and deliberate. I was no longer just Maggie, the grieving widow from the peninsula. I was the custodian of Frank's secret, the inheritor of a silent kingdom. The sting from Chloe's phone call was still there, but it was being replaced by something else. A cold, hard, an unfamiliar feeling. It was resolve. My mind was a spinning kaleidoscope of numbers and memories, each one tumbling over the other. $4.5 million. It was a sum so vast, so disconnected from the reality of my life, that it felt like a fiction. To ground myself, to make it real, I opened the leather folder again. I needed to see the details, to touch the papers that represented my husband's secret life's work. I pushed aside the share portfolio summary and the land deeds. My focus narrowed to the commercial property section, which Frank, in his methodical way, had organized into separate, clearly labeled files. I saw the file for the Geelong shops, the one for the warehouse in Laverton, and then my breath caught in my throat. There was a third file, bound in blue. The label, printed in Frank's neat capital letters, read, Claremont Street, South Yarra, South Yarra. The name echoed in my memory, laced with the sound of my daughter's proud, slightly condescending voice. It was her address, the one she would drop into conversation at every opportunity, the epicenter of her sophisticated, urban life, so far removed from my quiet existence on the peninsula. My fingers fumbled as I opened the file. Inside wasn't a deed for a single apartment, but for an entire building, a sleek, modern, low-rise block of 10 luxury units. The photos attached showed the manicured gardens, the secure underground parking, the glass balconies that shimmered in the sunday. And there, on the title deed, dated 7 years prior, was the owner's name, F&M Holdings Ty Limited. I sank back in my kitchen chair, the worn vinyl sighing under my weight. It wasn't just a building like hers, it was hers. Frank had bought her entire building. The irony was so thick, so crushingly profound, I felt I might choke on it. For years, Chloe had spoken of her life in South Yarra as a symbol of her success, her escape from the sleepy suburbs she'd grown up in. She'd complained, almost boastfully, about the insane rent they paid, framing it as the cost of living a life that truly mattered. I remembered a Christmas lunch, just 2 years ago, where she'd gone on and on about the building's gym and the proximity to the designer boutiques on Chapel Street. I'd felt a familiar pang of maternal inadequacy, the feeling that the simple, debt-free life Frank and I had built was somehow less vibrant, less ambitious. She had spoken of their landlord as some faceless corporation in the city, managed by a slick property agent who handled all their requests. All that time, every month when she and Liam transferred their rent, that money was flowing back into a company owned by the quiet, unassuming man she called Dad. Frank hadn't done it to be cruel or to control her. I knew him better than that. He would have seen it simply as a smart, stable investment. He bought the building because the numbers made sense. Using a property manager was his way of giving Chloe her independence, of allowing her to feel like she was making her own way in the world. He was a builder. He saw a solid structure in a good location, and he secured it. The fact that his own daughter lived there was a coincidence he likely found quietly amusing. He was, in his own practical way, subsidizing the very lifestyle she used to differentiate herself from us. She was performing a play about being a successful, independent woman, and all along her father owned the theater. The phone call from the morning replayed in my head, but this time it sounded different. Her cold, clinical words about liquefying assets now seemed utterly absurd. She had sold our family's past, the Lorne house, the cradle of her childhood, to fund a speculative future, all while living in a present that was completely underwritten by her parents' silent, invisible generosity. The power dynamic she believed she was operating under was a complete fiction. She thought she was a player in a high-stakes game, when in reality, she was living in a dollhouse her father had bought for her. She had built her entire identity around an address, a postcode, a certain kind of lifestyle. She never thought to look at the foundations. It's amazing what we choose to see, and what we choose to ignore, isn't it? We build these elaborate lives, but sometimes we forget to check who actually owns the land beneath our feet. A cold resolve began to crystallize in my heart, displacing the grief. Chloe and Liam thought they had made a clever, ruthless business decision. They had cashed in their emotional chips for financial ones. They had no idea that their mother, the quiet widow they'd so easily discarded, held the deed to their entire world. A plan, still vague and unformed, began to flicker at the edges of my mind. It was not about revenge, not exactly. It was about education. Frank was a builder, and he had taught me one thing. Before you can build anything new, you first have to clear the site and make sure the foundations are true. The revelation about the South Yarra apartment settled in my bones, not like a victory, but like a cold, heavy truth. My daughter was living in a gilded cage she didn't know I owned. But this knowledge felt incomplete. Frank wasn't a man for half measures. A list of assets was a statement of fact, but Frank's life was about purpose, about intention. There had to be more. There had to be instructions. My grief had momentarily been replaced by a sharp, focused curiosity. I felt like a detective, piecing together the last, most intricate project of my husband's life. I turned my attention back to the leather folder, running my hands over its smooth surface. This time, I searched more carefully, feeling inside the pockets and flaps. Tucked away in a zipped compartment at the very back, a place I had overlooked in my initial shock, was another sealed envelope. It was thick, made of heavy, cream-colored paper, and felt far more official than his first letter. The front was labeled in his unmistakable block letters, "My last will and testament for Maggie's eyes only." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the blueprint. I carried it back to the kitchen table, the legal-sized envelope feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. I opened it to find a stack of papers, dense with the kind of legal jargon that makes your head spin. I scanned through the formal language clauses, beneficiaries, executors. It was all there in black and white. F&M Holdings Pty Limited, and all its assets were to be transferred into my name. I was the sole executor of his estate. Legally, the silent empire was now mine. But I knew Frank. The true message, the real will, wouldn't be in the paragraphs written by a lawyer. I leafed towards the end, and sure enough, stapled to the very last page, was another handwritten letter. This one was different from the first. It was less of a comfort, and more of a final, solemn request. "Maggie," it began, "if you're reading this, the lawyers have probably already bored you to tears with their fancy words. This part is just for you. This is about Chloe." My breath hitched. "I love our girl more than life itself, you know that, but I worry. She's got your heart, but she's got this hunger for things that glitter, and I fear she can't tell the difference between gold and glass anymore. That husband of hers, he only deals in glass. He's taught her that a person's worth is measured by their postcode and the brand of their handbag. That's not the girl we raised, Maggie." I read on, my eyes flying across the page as Frank laid out his final, heartbreaking plan. "Everything we built, it's all yours now, to do with as you see fit. But I have one final request, my last project. I've set up a separate trust fund for Chloe in the amount of $250,000. It's hers, and only hers, on one condition. She is to receive it only after she has proven, to your satisfaction, that she has cared for you and stood on her own 2 feet for 1 full year without any knowledge of the larger inheritance. If, after that year, you feel she hasn't learned the value of family over fortune, I want you to dissolve the trust and donate the entire sum to the Royal Flying Doctor Service. They help people who are truly in need, people who understand what's really important. Let this be my final lesson to her, Maggie. Not a punishment, but a chance for her to find her way back to the girl we raised." A wave of understanding so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over me. My vague, angry thoughts of teaching Chloe a lesson suddenly felt petty and small. This wasn't my plan anymore. This was Frank's. This was his last act of fatherhood, an intricate, painful, and deeply loving attempt to save our daughter from herself. The decision was no longer mine to make out of spite or hurt. I was now the executor of his final, most important wish. The weight of it was immense. He loved his daughter so much that he was willing to let her stumble, to let her fall, so she could learn how to get up again. He trusted me to know when to extend a hand, and when to let her find her own strength. It's the hardest part of love, isn't it? Knowing when to protect someone, and when to let them face the consequences of their own choices. I folded the letter and placed it carefully back into the large envelope with the will. My anger had vanished, replaced by a powerful sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim of my daughter's callousness. I was a partner in my husband's final design. The path ahead was now terrifyingly clear. It was a path paved with deception, patience, and a love so fierce it had to be cruel to be kind. I looked at my phone, still sitting on the counter where I'd left it. The next move was Chloe's. But when she made it, when she inevitably came crawling back from the wreckage of her ambitions, I would be ready. I wouldn't be a grieving widow. I would be a gatekeeper, standing guard over my husband's legacy and our daughter's last chance at redemption. The weeks after that phone call bled into a quiet, lonely month. Then, too, autumn arrived on the peninsula, painting the leaves in shades of rust and gold. I went about my days with a deliberate routine. I tended the roses. I met my friends for coffee. I walked along the beach at sunset. On the surface, everything was normal. But underneath, I was living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The only news I had of my daughter came in the form of bright, hollow images on social media. Chloe, smiling with champagne on a rooftop bar overlooking the Singapore skyline. Chloe and Liam, arm in arm at a gala, with captions full of buzzwords like synergy and disrupting the market. It was a perfect, curated fantasy of success, and I watched it like one might watch a storm gathering on the horizon, knowing the calm was a lie. The first crack in their perfect facade didn't come from a desperate, tearful phone call. It came from a crisp, professional email. It was from the property manager for the South Yarra building, addressed to me as the director of F&M Holdings. "Dear Mrs. Franklin," it read, "just to keep you informed, the rent for apartment 7 has now been overdue for 30 days. We have sent the standard reminders with no response. Shall we begin the formal eviction process as per our agreement?" I read the email 3 times. My finger hovered over the keyboard. This was the first real test. I could intervene. I could tell him to wait, to give them more time. Frank's loving, protective voice whispered in my ear. But then I heard his other voice, the one from the letter, the voice of the planner, the father who knew his daughter needed to feel the full weight of her choices. With a steady hand, I typed my reply. "Thank you for the update. Please proceed according to standard protocol." I hit send. The first stone had been cast into the water. 2 more weeks passed. Then, one Tuesday night, long after I'd gone to bed, my phone rang, jolting me from a shallow sleep. It was an international number, the country code for Singapore. I answered, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. "Mum?" The voice was thin, ragged, and trembling, a ghost of the confident, cold voice from months ago. It was Chloe. The story came tumbling out, a frantic, chaotic torrent of words, punctuated by ragged sobs. The investors in Singapore were fake. The revolutionary tech platform was nothing but a slick website Liam had paid someone a few $100s to design. They had burned through the entire sum from the Lorne house, nearly $750,000 in less than 4 months. They weren't investing, they were living a lie, paying for extravagant dinners and 5-star hotels to create the illusion of success. The money had run out a month ago. The credit cards were maxed out. The loans they'd taken from short-term lenders were accruing interest at a terrifying rate. And then came the final, brutal blow. Liam was gone. She had woken up one morning in their hotel suite to find his side of the bed empty. He had cleared out their joint account, taken his passport, and left a short, typed note on the pillow. The note said he was pursuing a new venture, and she was, in his words, no longer a viable asset. He'd even taken her passport, though she later found it torn in half and thrown in a bin at the bottom of the hotel's service stairs. She was stranded, an illegal overstayer with no money and no way home. She'd had to beg for money from an acquaintance she barely knew just to buy a one-way ticket back to Melbourne. She had landed hours ago, exhausted and terrified. The final humiliation was waiting for her. She had taken a taxi to her beautiful South Yarra apartment, the one place she thought was hers, only to find the locks had been changed. A formal eviction notice from F&M Holdings was taped to the door. She was homeless. She was calling me from a public phone at Southern Cross Station, the sound of train announcements echoing behind her desperate sobs. She had absolutely nothing left. She had flown halfway across the world, burned every bridge, and shattered every connection, only to find that when you have absolutely nothing, there is often only one phone call you can make. Isn't it a strange comfort knowing that there's one door in the world that will always open for you, no matter how badly you've messed up? I listened to it all, the entire sorry tale, without saying a word. I let her empty herself of the panic and the shame. When she finally ran out of words, her voice trailing off into a broken whisper, "Mom, what do I do? I have nowhere to go." I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't lecture her. I didn't remind her of the home she had so carelessly sold. I just said the 5 words that were both an act of a mother's grace and the first move in a father's final loving test. "Come home, Chloe. Come home." I hung up, and in the quiet darkness of my house, I walked to the spare room, her old childhood bedroom, and I began to make the bed. An hour later, the headlights of a taxi swept across my living room window. I watched from the doorway as Chloe got out. The woman who stumbled out onto the curb was a stranger. The polished, confident daughter I knew from South Yara, the one draped in designer labels and radiating an aura of untouchable success, was gone. In her place was a thin, hunched figure in a crumpled linen suit, her hair a mess, her face pale and swollen from exhaustion and tears. She carried a single suitcase, one wheel broken and squeaking pitifully on the pavement. She looked up at the house, our simple brick home, as if seeing it for the first time, not as the place she'd been so desperate to escape, but as the last port in a terrible storm. She walked up the path, dragging the broken suitcase behind her. When she reached the porch light, she finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a shame so profound, I almost broke right then and there. My arms ached to hold her, to pull her in and tell her it would all be okay. But I remembered Frank's letter. I remembered the purpose. This was not the time for easy comfort. This was the beginning of the lesson. "Mum," she whispered, her voice cracking. She couldn't finish. I kept my own voice soft, steady. "You look exhausted, Chloe. Come inside. I'll put the kettle on." Those were the first lines in the play I would be performing for the next year. The role was that of Maggie Franklin, a simple widow on the peninsula, living a quiet life on her husband's modest pension, a woman with a heart big enough to forgive, but with resources too small to fix anything. Every part of it had to be perfect. The house itself was my main stage. I had deliberately left it untouched. The same faded floral curtains hung in the lounge. The same worn rug lay in front of the old television. There were no new appliances, no expensive renovations. My life, to all outward appearances, was one of careful budgeting. In the kitchen, I made her tea and a plate of toast with Vegemite, the comfort food of her childhood. She ate like a starving ghost, without seeming to taste any of it. She started to speak again, the words tumbling out in a rush of apologies and explanations about Liam, about the money, about Singapore. I held up a hand, gently. "Not tonight, love. There's a hot bath waiting for you. We can talk in the morning. You just need to sleep." She looked at me with confusion. She had expected a storm of anger, of recriminations, of "I told you so's." What she received was a quiet, almost detached compassion, and it seemed to disarm her completely. She nodded meekly and went to the bathroom. Later, I stood in the doorway of her old bedroom, watching her sleep. She was curled up in the single bed she'd had since she was a teenager, the city lights of her glamorous life replaced by the soft glow of a street lamp through her window. The sight of her, so broken and lost, tore at my heart. The maternal instinct to save, to rescue, to write a check and make all the bad things go away was a physical force, a roaring tide inside me. I wanted to storm into the living room, open Frank's leather folder, and show her the truth. I wanted to tell her that the eviction was a sham I could reverse with a single phone call, that the debts were a drop in the ocean of what we really had. But the image of Frank's steady handwriting, the weight of his final wish, held me back. I was his executor. This pain was a necessary part of his plan. Every word of comfort felt like a carefully placed stone in the wall I was building around the truth. I had to become a stranger in my own home, a performer in a play for an audience of one. Have you ever had to hide a difficult truth from someone you love, believing you were doing it for their own good? It's a lonely, complicated place to be. The next morning, I was up at dawn, out in the garden with my hands in the soil, just as I always was. When Chloe finally emerged, looking lost and pale in the bright kitchen, the new dynamic was set. I was the steady, predictable constant. She was the unmoored ship, drifting in the quiet harbor of her past. She was home, but she wasn't safe from the consequences of her choices. She just didn't know that the architect of those consequences was the same woman who was now kindly offering her a cup of tea. The performance had begun. The first few weeks of Chloe's return were like living with a ghost. She drifted through the rooms of her childhood home, a specter of her former self, wrapped in a shroud of shame. She slept until noon, watched endless hours of mindless television, and spoke only when spoken to. Her ambition, the bright, ferocious engine that had driven her for years, had completely stalled. She was adrift, and I, in my carefully constructed role, was the quiet, unassuming lighthouse keeper, offering a steady, distant light, but doing nothing to guide her ship to shore. I'd make her dinner, wash her clothes, and listen to the silence between us grow deeper and more cavernous with each passing day. I was letting her sit in the wreckage, letting the reality of her failure seep into her bones, just as Frank's letter had instructed. The catalyst, when it came, wasn't a letter from a debt collector or another frantic phone call. It came on a sunny Thursday afternoon, a call from a number I hadn't seen in years. It was Bill, the president of the Lorne Surf Life Saving Club and an old friend of Frank's. "Maggie, love, it's Bill," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "A few of us down here at the club were just talking about you and Frank. We were so terribly sorry to hear the news." I paused, my hand frozen on the kitchen counter. "What news is that, Bill?" There was an awkward silence on the other end of the line. "Well, about your health," he said, his voice dropping, "and having to sell the beach house. Chloe and that husband of hers told us you'd had a bad turn and were moving into high-level aged care up in Melbourne. Said you needed the money from the sale to cover the costs. We were all devastated for you, Maggie." The world, which had already tilted once, now spun completely off its axis. My own daughter had not just sold my home, she had sold a story of my impending death to do it. I could hear the television in the next room, a meaningless laugh track from some sitcom. My daughter was in there, hiding from her life, while a fiction of her creation was living a life of its own 100 kilometers down the coast. I kept my voice steady, a miracle of self-control. "Bill, can you tell me exactly what she said?" The story he told was far worse than I could have imagined. Chloe and Liam hadn't just sold the house. They had performed a masterpiece of deceit. They had attended a club meeting, looking distraught. They had told everyone that I had a rapidly progressing degenerative illness and that doctors had given me only a few years of independent living. They'd used the community's deep respect for Frank, a man who had volunteered for the club for 30 years, as leverage. They'd leveraged people's sympathy to create a sense of urgency, allowing them to accept a quick, low-ball offer on the house. And the buyer wasn't a young family looking to create their own memories. It was a faceless development corporation from the city. Bill's next words hit me like a physical blow. "They've already gotten council approval, Maggie. They're planning to knock the old place down next month, putting up a block of 8 luxury apartments. The whole town's furious about it, but their hands are tied." The wrecking ball, a literal physical manifestation of my daughter's betrayal, poised to shatter the house Frank had built, to wipe our history off the map. My quiet resolve hardened into a cold, sharp anger. This wasn't just about greed anymore. This was a desecration. She had used a lie about my frailty to justify her actions. She had made me an object of pity in a community where I had always been a figure of strength. She had, in the most profound way, disrespected the legacy of her father and the love of her mother. A simple lie for money had spiraled into a public fiction that had tarnished our family name and was about to physically erase our past from the face of the earth. It's frightening how quickly a lie can take on a life of its own, isn't it? Growing bigger and more destructive than you ever imagined. I thanked Bill for letting me know, my voice a tight, controlled whisper, and ended the call. I stood in the hallway, the plastic of the cordless phone cold in my hand. I could hear Chloe laughing at something on the television. The sound was hollow, meaningless. The time for quiet observation, for patient waiting, was over. Frank wanted her to learn a lesson, and I realized with chilling clarity that the lesson had to begin now. She couldn't hide from this. She had to see, with her own 2 eyes, the rubble of the life she had so carelessly demolished. I walked towards the living room, my steps slow and deliberate. The performance was over. It was time for the first act of the reckoning. I walked into the living room and pressed the power button on the television remote. The screen went black, plunging the room into an abrupt, jarring silence. Chloe looked up from the sofa, startled, her eyes wide with confusion. The soft, gentle mother she had been living with for the past few weeks was gone. In her place stood a woman she didn't recognize, a woman with eyes as hard and gray as the sea in a winter storm. "Get your shoes on," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "We're going for a drive." "A drive?" "Mum, where are we going? It's almost 5 o'clock. Bill from the Lorne Surf Club called me an hour ago," I stated, letting each word land with the weight of a stone. He was very sorry to hear about my degenerative illness. He wanted to know how I was settling into the nursing home. The color drained from Chloe's face. The lazy comfort vanished from her posture, replaced by a rigid, defensive fear. She knew. "Get your shoes on now." The drive was the longest 2 hours of my life. Chloe sat in the passenger seat of my 10-year-old Toyota hatchback, a car she had once called my granny mobile, and stared out the window. The silence inside the small car was immense, a living thing that pressed in on us from all sides. It was heavier than any argument, more damning than any accusation. A few times, she opened her mouth to speak, a desperate apology forming on her lips. But I cut her off with a single, sharp glance. "Don't," I said. "Not a word. We'll talk when we get there." She shrank back into her seat, and the silence resumed. We left the suburbs of Melbourne behind and turned onto the Great Ocean Road. How many times had we driven this road as a family? It was the path to every summer holiday, the backdrop to our happiest memories. I remembered Frank driving, his arm resting on the open window, the salty wind whipping through the car. I remembered Chloe in the back seat, singing off-key to the radio, her face sticky with ice cream from our usual stop in Anglesea. But today, the road felt different. The majestic cliffs and the crashing waves of the Southern Ocean didn't look beautiful. They looked menacing. Every familiar curve and landmark was a fresh stab of betrayal. This sacred path had been the starting point of a journey that ended in the complete demolition of our family's trust. When we finally arrived in Lorne, the town was quiet, slumbering in the late afternoon sun of the off-season. I didn't drive up the hill to our street. Instead, I parked right on the main esplanade across from the pub. "Get out," I said. "Mum, what are we doing?" "We're going to walk," I replied, my voice leaving no room for argument. "I want you to see the town you lied to." That walk was an exercise in slow, deliberate cruelty, and I didn't feel a shred of remorse. I made her walk with me down the main street. We passed the bakery where Frank used to buy his morning paper, the owner giving us a hesitant, pitying nod. We passed the little grocery store, where the woman behind the counter, a woman who had known Chloe since she was a toddler, suddenly became very busy stacking apples, unable to meet our eyes. The fiction Chloe had woven was everywhere. It was in the sympathetic glances of strangers, in the awkward silence of old friends. With every step, Chloe hunched further into herself, her face burning with a shame so palpable it was like a heat coming off her skin. She was being forced to breathe the toxic air of her own creation. Apologies are just words, aren't they? Easy to say when you're caught, but true remorse, true understanding, that's a different language. It's spoken in the shame of meeting a neighbor's eyes. Have you ever had to face a consequence so real, so tangible, that it changed you in an instant? It's a painful, but sometimes necessary, turning point. Finally, we turned up the steep hill towards our street, and there it was, or what was left of it. The familiar, welcoming beach house was gone, replaced by a crime scene. A temporary wire fence, the kind they use at construction sites, cordoned off the entire property. A huge, garish sign for a demolition company was hammered into the lawn where Chloe used to play. The windows were boarded up, like the vacant eyes of a corpse. It was no longer a home, it was a condemned building, a dead thing waiting to be erased. That was what finally broke her. The sight of it, so final, so brutally real, shattered her composure. She stopped dead on the footpath, and a sound, a terrible guttural sob, tore from her throat. "Oh, Mum," she cried, her body shaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving with the force of her weeping. I stood beside her, my own heart a cold, hard stone in my chest, and watched. I didn't reach for her. I didn't offer a single word of comfort. I just let her cry in the ruins of our past. After a long moment, I spoke, my voice as unforgiving as the wind coming off the ocean. "Now you see it," I said. "Now you see what you've done." The drive back from Lorne was a journey through a vacuum. The tense, angry silence on the way there had been replaced by a silence of pure, hollowed-out despair. Chloe didn't cry. She just sat staring out at the dark ocean, her reflection a ghostly image against the glass. The enormity of what she had done, of the lies she had told and the heritage she had condemned, had finally settled upon her. There were no more excuses, no more deflections. There was only the quiet, humming engine of my Toyota, carrying us back towards a future that was now a complete and terrifying blank for her. When we got home, the performance was over. The pretense of me being a fragile, simple widow and her being a guest in my house evaporated. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the new reality as we stood in the kitchen. "You can stay here, Chloe," I said, my voice calm and practical. "But you need to understand, this is my home. I live on a pension, and I have bills to pay. Frank's passing changed my financial situation drastically. I cannot support you. You will contribute to this household. You will find a job. You will pay board. End of story." The job hunt was a brutal education. The Chloe, who had once confidently networked in the glass towers of Singapore, was now sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through online job boards for entry-level work. Her resume, once a glittering document of ambitious projects and impressive-sounding roles, was now a work of fiction. The tech startup was a black hole of failure, and Liam had vanished, leaving a trail of debt and broken promises. Potential employers saw the gaps, the unverifiable claims, and the rejections came swiftly, if at all. For the first time in her adult life, my daughter was faced with a world that was not impressed by her charm or her expensive clothes. It was a world that demanded proof of work, and she had none. After 3 weeks of failures, she finally found something. It wasn't in a chic Melbourne laneway or a stylish South Yarra boutique. It was at a loud, chaotic, no-frills cafe in Frankston, a tough, working-class suburb, a bus ride away. This was the true rock bottom. The woman who used to critique the froth on her almond latte was now the one being yelled at to clean the milk frother. The woman who thought nothing of a $100 brunch was now earning just over $20 an hour to scrape burnt cheese off sandwich presses and haul heavy bags of garbage out to the bins. Her new life was a relentless grind. Her alarm went off at 5 in the morning, long before the sun was up. She would catch the bus, her face pale and drawn in the harsh fluorescent light. She'd work a frantic 8-hour shift, a blur of shouting orders, clattering plates, and the constant, high-pitched scream of the coffee machine's steam wand. I watched the transformation from a careful distance. I saw the expensive leather handbag be replaced by a cheap canvas backpack. I saw her soft, manicured hands become red, chapped, and calloused. I saw the arrogant tilt of her chin slowly disappear, replaced by the weary slump of someone who is physically and emotionally exhausted day in and day out. My heart ached for her. There were nights I'd lie awake, listening to the floorboards creak as she came home, smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant, and the urge to end her suffering was almost overwhelming. I could have stopped it all. But I would see Frank's face in my mind, hear his words from the letter, and my resolve would harden. This was not a punishment. It was a crucible. She was being burned down to her very foundations so that she could, perhaps, be rebuilt into something stronger. There is a unique kind of dignity that comes only from exhaustion earned through honest work. It strips you of your ego. There's no hiding from yourself when you're on your feet for 8 hours, is there? It's a powerful, if painful way to reintroduce yourself to the person you really are. The first glimmer of hope came about a month into her new job. She came home late one Friday evening, looking even more tired than usual. She walked into the kitchen, avoided my eyes, and placed a small, crumpled pile of cash on the table, 2 $50 notes. "For board," she mumbled, before turning and heading straight for her room. I looked at the money, at the worn, faded faces of the figures on the notes. It was the first money she had earned with her own 2 hands in years. It was the first contribution she had made to anything other than her own ambition. In that moment, that $100 was more precious to me than the millions sitting silently in the bank. It was proof. The lesson, in all its cruelty, was beginning to work. 6 months passed. 6 months of Chloe waking in the darkness, of the weary slump in her shoulders when she came home, of the small pile of cash she left on the kitchen counter every second Friday without a word. The change in her was gradual, but profound. The hard shell of her ambition had been chipped away, and underneath, I began to see glimpses of the daughter I thought I had lost. She started asking about my day. She began helping in the garden on her days off, her formerly manicured hands sinking into the rich soil. She was quieter, more thoughtful, and for the first time in years, she seemed to be truly present. She was learning the value of small things, of honest work, of a quiet home. I saw it, I felt it, and I knew. It was time. Frank's test wasn't about a specific date on a calendar, it was about a change in the heart. She was ready to know the truth. I approached her one evening after dinner. "Chloe," I began, my voice carefully casual, "I've made an appointment with a lawyer in the city for next week. It's with a community legal service that helps seniors sort out their affairs. I need to finally get Frank's estate in order, what little there is of it. I'd like you to come with me, for support." She looked up, her brow furrowed with concern. "Of course, Mum. But can you afford a lawyer?" "This one offers a free first consultation," I lied smoothly. "It's just to see where we stand." She agreed immediately, her acceptance, a quiet testament to the new sense of duty she felt. The following Tuesday, we took the train into the city. Chloe was dressed in her neat, clean cafe uniform, a stark contrast to the designer clothes she used to wear in these same streets. The address I had given her wasn't for a cramped community legal office. It was for a building on Collins Street, a skyscraper of glass and steel that hummed with the energy of old money and corporate power. When we stepped into the plush, silent reception of Henderson and Associates on the 34th floor, Chloe's eyes widened in intimidation. She looked at her worn shoes on the thick wool carpet and suddenly seemed very small. Mr. Henderson greeted us warmly but professionally. He was an older gentleman, with kind eyes that belied a sharp intellect, exactly the sort of man Frank would have trusted. He led us into a boardroom with a panoramic view of the city. "Thank you for coming in, Maggie, Chloe," he began, gesturing for us to sit. Chloe was tense, expecting to be bored by a dry conversation about pensions and funeral expenses. But Mr. Henderson didn't start there. He slid a thin file across the polished mahogany table towards Chloe. "Miss Franklin," he said, his voice gentle, "before we discuss your father's estate, there is another matter. My firm was engaged by your mother several months ago to investigate the financial activities of your former partner, Mr. Liam O'Connell." Chloe stared at me, her face a mask of shock. "We have found substantial and irrefutable evidence of fraud," he continued. "He forged your signature on at least 3 major loan applications. You are a victim, Chloe. We can have all of his debts legally separated from you." Chloe was speechless, looking from the file to my face, trying to process the fact that while she thought I was passively watching her struggle, I had been actively fighting a war for her on a front she didn't even know existed. But before she could find her voice, Mr. Henderson slid the large, familiar leather folder to the center of the table. "And that," he said, his voice shifting, "brings us to your father's estate." He opened it and laid out the F&M Holdings asset summary. I watched my daughter's face as she read. I saw the initial confusion give way to disbelief, her eyes darting from the list of properties to the staggering numbers next to them. I saw the moment her brain finally processed the total at the bottom of the page. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. She looked at me, her eyes screaming, a question her mouth couldn't form. But before the shock of the money could fully land, I reached into my handbag, took out Frank's handwritten codicil, and slid it across the table. "There's one more thing you need to read, love," I said softly. "This is the most important part." She picked up the letter. She read her father's words, his love, his fear for her, his final, heartbreaking test. And that is when she finally broke. The sound of her weeping filled the silent, expensive room. But these were not the tears of a woman who had just discovered she was rich. These were the tears of a daughter who had just discovered the true depth of her father's love. In that moment, the $4.5 million on the page became meaningless. All that mattered were the words of a simple builder who had seen his daughter losing her way and had constructed one last, elaborate and painful plan to guide her home. The eviction, my silence, her job, it was all a language of love she had never learned. The language of a father who would risk her hatred to give her a chance to save herself. We spend so much of our lives thinking we know our parents, don't we? And then a moment comes along that reveals a depth of their love and foresight that leaves you breathless. She didn't look at the financial statement again. She just clutched her father's letter to her chest and looked at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled not with anger, but with a look of pure, devastating awe. Mr. Henderson, with the quiet discretion of a man accustomed to navigating emotional minefields, poured a glass of water and placed it in front of Chloe. The silence in the boardroom was no longer tense or awkward. It was reverent, filled with the weight of a lifetime of unspoken love. Chloe sat with her father's letter clutched in her hands, her tears slowly subsiding, leaving trails on her pale cheeks. The shock had passed, and in its place was the dawn of a devastating, beautiful understanding. She finally looked up, not at the financial documents, but at me. Her voice, when she spoke, was a raw, trembling whisper. "Why?" she asked, the single word holding a universe of pain and confusion. "Why, Mum? I don't understand. You watched me. You watched me fall apart, every single day. You knew you could fix it all with a phone call. Why did you let me go through that?" This was the question. The one I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times in the lonely hours of the night, the one Frank had trusted me to answer. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the cool mahogany table, and I met her gaze. "Chloe, listen to me very carefully," I began, my voice soft but firm. "This was never, not for a single second, a punishment. Watching you struggle, watching you come home exhausted and defeated day after day, it was the hardest thing I have ever done. It broke my heart a little more each night." Her brow furrowed, the confusion still there. "This wasn't my plan, love. This was your father's last gift to you. It was his final project." I pointed to the letter in her hands. "Your father saw everything. He was a quiet man, but he saw it all. He saw the path you were on with Liam. He saw that the more you chased after that glittering life of success, the more of your own light you lost. He saw you forgetting who you were, where you came from. He saw you losing yourself, and it terrified him." I took a breath, letting the words sink in. "He didn't want to just leave you a fortune, Chloe. Any man can do that. He wanted to give you something priceless. He wanted to give you back your own worth. The kind of worth that doesn't come from a bank statement or a South Yarra postcode, but the kind you feel in your bones when you've done a hard day's work for an honest wage. The kind you can't buy, borrow, or inherit." Her eyes, filled with tears, never left mine. "He knew you had to lose everything you thought you wanted," I continued, "so you could finally discover what you truly needed. He let you fall, but he made sure I was standing at the bottom to build a safety net. This whole time, you thought you were in a free fall, but you were never in danger. You were just in a lesson. Your father's last, most important lesson." Chloe's voice was barely audible. "So, he knew? He knew I would fail?" "No," I said, and this was the most important truth of all. "He didn't know you would fail. He knew you were strong enough to find your way back. He was a builder, Chloe. He knew that before you can build something that will last, you have to tear down the faulty structure. Your life was built on a foundation of glass. He needed you to see it shatter, so you could learn to build on rock." It was the ultimate paradox. The greatest act of parental providing was to provide nothing at all. Sometimes the most profound lessons in life are the ones we have to learn in the dark, without a map. Have you ever been grateful for a hardship that ultimately made you stronger? Mr. Henderson cleared his throat softly, adding his own validation. "Your father was a very unique man, Miss Franklin. In my 30 years of practice, I've written many wills. Most are about the division of assets. His was the first I've ever seen that was about the restoration of a person." The last traces of confusion and hurt finally washed away from Chloe's face, replaced by a look of profound, aching gratitude. The pain of the last 6 months was retroactively transformed from a meaningless punishment into a purposeful, loving act. It was a crucible forged for her by a father who loved her and a mother who was strong enough to see his vision through. She slowly reached her hand across the vast, polished table, her fingers finding mine. Her grip was weak at first, then it tightened, holding on as if she were drowning. And for the first time since that terrible phone call months ago, we were no longer a performer and an audience, or a warden and a prisoner. We were just a mother and a daughter, finally telling the truth. The train ride home from the city was a world away from the tense, silent journey into town. We sat side by side, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track, a soothing, steady beat. Chloe was quiet, looking out the window as the gleaming skyscrapers of the CBD gave way to the familiar, sprawling suburbs, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of shame or anger, it was the quiet of profound, overwhelming contemplation. She was, I think, meeting herself for the first time in a very long time, and also meeting the parents she never truly knew. The weight of Frank's love, a force she now understood was as immense and invisible as gravity, was settling over her, reshaping her reality. That evening, I expected a conversation about the future. I expected her to hand in her notice at the Frankston Cafe. It was the logical next step. The legal and financial burdens had been lifted. The need for that grueling minimum wage job was gone. I was ready to help her plan, to talk about her options, to finally open the door to the resources her father had left for her. But Chloe surprised me. As I was making dinner, she came into the kitchen, her hands shoved nervously into the pockets of her cheap jeans. "Mum," she said, her voice steady, "I'm not quitting my job." I paused, a half-peeled potato in my hand. "You don't have to keep working there, love. You know that now." "I know," she said, and she finally met my eyes. There was a new strength in them, a clarity I hadn't seen since she was a young girl. "But I have to. The old me would have quit in a heartbeat. The old me would have seen this money as an escape hatch. But it's not my money, Mum. It's yours and Dad's. I haven't done a single thing to earn it. That job is the first honest thing I've done in a decade. The money I've been giving you for board, the few dollars I have in my bank account, that's mine. I earned it. I need to keep doing that. I need to prove to myself that I can." And there it was, the proof, the undeniable evidence that Frank's painful, elaborate lesson had worked. She understood, in a way that no lecture or inheritance ever could have taught her, the fundamental difference between wealth and worth. So, the routine continued, but everything had changed. She still woke in the dark, still caught the early bus, still came home smelling of coffee, but she no longer carried the air of defeat. She came home with a quiet dignity. She would tell me stories, not about her own struggles, but about her co-workers, a single mother working 2 jobs, a young student saving for university. Her world, which had once been a small, selfish bubble, was expanding. She was developing empathy, forged in the fires of her own hardship. A month later, she took another step. She started coming home even later on her days off. She looked tired, but in a different way, a good way. I didn't ask. I waited. It was my neighbor Mavis who finally told me. "Saw your Chloe down at the Salvo's community kitchen the other day," she said over the fence while I was weeding. "She was serving soup. Seemed to be working harder than anyone. She's a good kid, that one." That night I mentioned it casually. "Mavis said she saw you at the kitchen." Chloe blushed, embarrassed to be caught doing good. "It's just a few hours a week," she said, looking down at her hands. After everything, I just felt like I had to. I know what it feels like to be hungry for more than just food, to be hungry for a bit of kindness. It feels right. It makes sense." She wasn't trying to erase her past mistakes with a few grand performative gestures. She was trying to build a better future on top of them, one small, humble act at a time. She was learning that true atonement isn't found in apologies, but in action. It's in the quiet, unseen work you do when no one is watching, for people who can do nothing for you in return. Isn't that where real character is revealed? Not in the grand gestures we make for an audience, but in the small, consistent choices we make when we think we are alone. I realized then that Frank's plan had succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. The goal wasn't just to save her from Liam's debts or to teach her the value of money. The goal was to remake her character. The money in the bank, the properties, the shares, it had all become secondary. The real fortune was this new person emerging before my eyes, a woman who was learning that the greatest wealth isn't what you own, but what you give away. The foundation was now solid rock. Spring arrived, and with it came a sense of fragile renewal, both in my garden and in my daughter. Chloe continued to work at the cafe, and her volunteer shifts at the community kitchen became the anchor of her week. The change in her was real and lasting. We had found a new rhythm, a quiet, respectful partnership I never thought possible. Then one morning, a letter arrived that disturbed our peace. It was a thin, official-looking envelope from the Surf Coast Shire Council, a standard notification to neighboring properties about a development application. It was for the Lorne property. The plans had been finalized. Demolition was imminent. Reading the cold, bureaucratic language felt like having a wound torn open. "We have to go back," I said to Chloe that evening, placing the letter on the table between us. "We have to see it one last time, to say a proper goodbye." A shadow passed over her face, the familiar ghost of her shame. But she nodded. "Okay, Mum, we should." The next morning, I handed her a set of car keys. They weren't for my Toyota. They were heavy, old-fashioned keys, attached to a faded leather fob with the Ford logo on it. She looked at them, confused. "Go look in the garage," I said softly. She opened the door to the garage, and a moment later I heard a sharp, choked gasp. I followed her out. There, parked where my little hatchback usually sat, was Frank's old Ford Falcon. It was gleaming, the deep blue paint polished to a mirror shine. I had tasked Mr. Henderson with finding it months ago. It had been sold to a collector in Ballarat who, after hearing a carefully edited version of the story, had agreed to sell it back to me. I had been waiting for the right moment. This was it. Chloe walked around the car, her hand hovering just above the paint, as if she were afraid to touch it. Tears streamed down her face. It was the first piece of her betrayal that had been tangibly undone, a symbol of a past that could perhaps be reclaimed. The drive down the Great Ocean Road this time was a pilgrimage, not a punishment. We drove with the windows down, the scent of the salt and the bush filling the car, just as it had 100 times before. We didn't listen to the radio. Instead, we talked. Chloe told me stories about Frank teaching her to fish off the Lorne Pier. I told her about bringing her to that house for the first time as a baby. We were rebuilding our shared history, one memory at a time. The oppressive, angry silence of our last trip was replaced by a healing quiet. When we arrived at the street, we both fell silent. The temporary fence was still there, but behind it, there was nothing. Just a flat, empty rectangle of dirt, scarred with the deep tracks of heavy machinery. The house was gone. The garden I had spent years tending was gone. The only thing left standing was the huge, gnarled gum tree at the very back of the property, a lonely sentinel guarding an empty space. The finality of it was absolute. A lifetime of memories had been bulldozed into the earth. We got out of the car and stood on the footpath, just staring at the void. Chloe was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just empty. All those Christmases, all of Dad's work, just gone. It feels so wrong for this beautiful piece of land to just become a block of concrete apartments for investors who will never love it, who will never know its story." I saw the opening, the flicker of a new idea in her pained words. "The developers hit a snag," I said quietly. "Mr. Henderson found out. Their financing is shaky. They might be looking for a quick sale to cut their losses." I let the statement hang in the air. Chloe looked from the empty land to me, her eyes wide. "We could buy it back?" "We could," I confirmed. "But what would we do with it, Chloe? We can't rebuild the past." And then, the daughter my husband had hoped for, the woman who had been forged in the crucible of the last 6 months, finally emerged. "No," she said, a new energy in her voice. "We can't rebuild our past, but maybe we can build a future for someone else." She looked at me, her idea taking shape as she spoke. "What about the people I meet at the kitchen? Families who have lost everything, people who have never had a holiday in their lives. What if this wasn't just our house? What if it could be a house for them?" We stood on that empty plot of land, the ghost of our past all around us. We could have let it be a monument to our pain. But right there, we made a choice to build something new from the rubble. Isn't that the most powerful thing we can do? To take the ugliest, most painful parts of our story and turn them into a source of hope for someone else. We got back into Frank's car, the symbol of what was lost and now was found. As we drove away, we weren't leaving a graveyard of memories behind. We were leaving a construction site for a new beginning. We had a plan, a project, a purpose that was bigger than both of us. Frank's final lesson was complete, and now it was time to build upon it. The months that followed our visit to Lorne were a whirlwind of purposeful action. The listless, grieving widow and the broken, shamed daughter were gone. In our place were two women with a mission. With Mr. Women with Boss Henderson guiding us through the legal maze, we began the process of turning our idea into a reality. We successfully negotiated the purchase of the land from the developers, who were more than happy to offload a project that had become a local controversy. Then, we established a charitable foundation in my husband's name, the Franklin Legacy Project. It was in this work that I saw Chloe truly come alive. All the ambition and intelligence she had once poured into Liam's hollow schemes, she now directed towards this new purpose. She was relentless. She spent hours on the phone with the council, navigating permits and regulations. She met with architects, not to design a monument to wealth, but to create a space of welcome and comfort. The plans for what we began to call Frank's Place were beautiful in their simplicity. It was a classic Australian beach house, reimagined for a new purpose. A long, single-story building with a wide, wraparound veranda, designed to be accessible for everyone. It had a huge, open-plan kitchen and living area, designed for large families to gather, and a massive deck with a built-in barbecue area, perfect for warm summer evenings. Every detail was chosen not for its prestige, but for its durability, its comfort, its ability to withstand the loving chaos of children and the weary feet of parents in need of a rest. News of what we were doing trickled through the Lorne community. The initial whispers and sideways glances were replaced by a groundswell of support. Bill from the surf club was the first to call, offering to round up a crew of volunteers to help with the landscaping. Local tradesmen, many of whom had known and respected Frank, offered their services at cost. The very community that Chloe had so profoundly deceived now rallied to help her in her act of redemption. They saw her, not as the arrogant girl who had lied to them, but as Frank's daughter finally doing the right thing. To ensure the project would have a life beyond us, we formed a partnership with Vinnie's, the Street Vincent de Paul Society, one of Australia's most trusted charities. They would manage the selection process, identifying families from across Victoria who were experiencing hardship, financial struggles, illness, bereavement, and offering them a week's stay at Frank's Place, completely free of charge, to rest, reconnect, and feel the healing power of the ocean. Almost a year to the day after we stood on that empty plot of dirt, we held the opening. It wasn't a fancy gala. It was a simple afternoon barbecue on the new deck. Our friends from Lorne were there, the volunteer tradesmen, a representative from Vinnie's, and the first family who would be staying, a young couple with 3 small children whose farm had been devastated by bushfires earlier that year. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Chloe and I stood by the railing, watching the children chase each other on the new lawn. "Dad would have loved this," she said, her voice quiet. "He would have been in his element, making sure everyone had a sausage and a cold drink. This is so much better than just having the house back for ourselves." "He is here, love," I said, placing my hand on her arm. "He's in every piece of timber, in the laughter of those kids. He didn't leave us a fortune, Chloe. He left us a task. He left us a chance to turn our deepest wound into a gift." I looked at my daughter, at the strong, compassionate, and wise woman she had become, and my heart swelled with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. The true inheritance wasn't the money. It was her. It was this new, unbreakable bond between us, forged in truth and shared purpose. We had taken a story of betrayal, lies, and loss, and turned it into a story of hope and community. The old house was gone, but the spirit of what made it a home was now stronger than ever. It just goes to show that our true legacy isn't the things we leave behind, but the impact we have on the lives we touch. What kind of legacy are you hoping to build in your own life? As the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been excruciating, a long walk through a dark valley of grief and betrayal. But we had emerged on the other side, not just intact but transformed. Justice had arrived, not as a thunderclap of revenge, but as the gentle, healing rhythm of the tide. Frank's last project was complete, his foundation was secure, and his legacy of love was finally, truly, home. Thank you for staying with me through this story. It's funny, isn't it? How life can be shattered into a million pieces, and yet, somehow, be rebuilt into something even more beautiful than it was before. Standing on that deck at Frank's place, watching a new family build their own happy memories on the foundations of our deepest pain, I finally understood the full scope of my husband's wisdom. He knew that money was just a tool, like the hammers he used to swing. It could be used to build a wall, or it could be used to build a home. It could be used for selfish ambition, or it could be used to create a sanctuary. The lesson he left for Chloe, and for me, was that our true inheritance is never about the assets we accumulate. It's about the love we cultivate, the forgiveness we offer, and the legacy of kindness we choose to build. Chloe learned that her worth wasn't tied to an address or a bank balance. It was tied to her actions, her empathy, and her capacity to care for others. And I learned that true love, the kind that lasts a lifetime and beyond, is sometimes about having the courage to let go, to trust in a difficult lesson, and to have faith that the people you love will find their way back home. Did my story resonate with you? I'd love to hear which part you connected with most in the comments below. It's a long and winding road, this life, and it's nice to know we aren't walking it alone. And just for fun, let me know which city or part of the world you're listening from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories can travel. If you enjoyed this journey and would like to support the channel, you can send a super thanks. Your support truly helps me continue to create and share these stories with all of you. On the screen now are 2 more stories I've chosen for you. There are so many more on my channel, so please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until we meet in the next story, thank you for listening, with love and respect.